Good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Chalmers. I'm the chairperson of the New Zealand Fabian Society, and I welcome you here this evening for the Katherine Trebeck event. We've been looking forward to this. Gareth Hughes put us onto Katherine, and we've been looking forward to having it. I'll just note for the people that are in the room, we've moved our AV equipment, so if any of you are thinking of donating or joining the Fabians, this is what we've been spending it on here. There's about $12,000 worth of equipment. The Trades Hall Trust has put in, you'll notice in the ceiling now we have a column coming down with all the electrics, so we've been able to shift our into a semi-permanent position, our AV studio, and we're looking forward to opening this up for progressive groups to use when they have the opportunity. I'd like to firstly welcome Gareth to introduce Katherine.
Well, kia ora, te mihi nui, kia koutou, kia ora. It's really wonderful to see you all here tonight, and it's such a privilege to share a true global thought leader with you this evening. So I'm Gareth Hughes, I'm the director of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, Aotearoa. We're part of a global mission with an ambitious goal, which is to reshape the economy so it's in service to life. An economy that's designed around the well-being of people and planet, rather than the status quo, right, which is us, people and planet, in service to the economy. I've come to this mahi through many experiences, and I feel like, I've spent my life now, 25 years, trying to make a better world. And I feel like I've tried almost every tactic possible. I've tried campaigning, leading 6,000 people marching out for climate change in Queen Street once upon a time. I've tried governance, I've tried legal avenues, I've tried non-violent direct action, I've tried hands-on conservation work and getting food to people over COVID. I even tried politics for a decade, where I negotiated with prime ministers and ministers and got to pass laws and legislation. And I sort of reflected, we've won some, we've lost some, but all that time I've spent focused on the symptoms. When I was working on child poverty or housing or climate change, I was focused downstream. We need to question, why are these problems happening in such a wealthy society? We need to think upstream and ask ourselves, can the economy do more to deliver well-being for people and the planet? So I describe our mahi in New Zealand as like a think tank and a do tank. Our theory of change is this big, audacious goal. It's going to take new knowledge, so it's going to take new research and our latest reports around community wealth building, a very successful economic development strategy you can see pockets of, particularly in the Southern Initiative in Tāmaki Makaurau. It's going to take new knowledge, a new narrative, a new story we tell ourselves on the role of the economy, our history and power dynamics, and it's going to take new connections. And that's where the wellbeing economy is grounded, we all. So it's a privilege to have Katherine Trebeck in New Zealand this week. She's keynoting our Economy for Public Good conference in Poniki on Thursday. But she's such an amazing thinker, we wanted to share her with everyone in the country. So doing events in Tāmaki Makaurau and Otatahi. Katherine started at Oxfam. She's the author of Arrival, An Economics of Possibility. She's a co-founder of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, this global movement to reshape the economy. She's now based at the Centre for Policy Development, the Club of Rome, wears many other hats, and it's a great privilege to have Katherine with us tonight. Thank you very much for hosting us, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Gareth, and thank you, Paul and Phil and the team for having me this evening. It's just fantastic to be here. I feel very, very honoured. I've long been a fan of the work of the Fabians, and I think you'll see sort of the influence in what I want to talk to you about tonight. I want to start by acknowledging this beautiful land. This is the wonderful hill just behind the house where I live in Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. And it's really important, as you'd imagine in Australia, that I sort of recognise that the economic wealth of Australia, they saw this GDP as we measure it now, stands on the shoulders of stolen land. And I want to take the time to pay my respects to the First Nations folk of Australia, and also, of course, First Nations here in New Zealand. And I want to just talk you through pretty big picture of the Wellbeing Economy agenda, give you a bit of a sense on some of the key elements of what it's about. And then I understand we've got quite a chunk of time when we can dive into various aspects. You can take the conversation where you want, but I'd love to hear about your experience too, and the various bits and pieces you're working on too. So let's see the second half of our time as a discussion rather than just a sort of more traditional Q&A. But I want to start with this wonderful quote that has sort of inspired the title of my talk, A Time for Revolutions or for Patching. And this beautiful quote that a revolutionary moment in the world's history is a time for revolution, not for patching. And this is very much a nod to the Fabians in that this was written by Sir William Beveridge in the midst of midst of the Second World War. And these were the words he wrote on the front pages of the document that laid the basis for the UK's welfare system and for the NHS. And I think it's hard to deny that we are very much in a revolutionary time in history today. We see the extent to which human activity, and I'll come back to that word human activity is pushing Mother Nature beyond what she can handle. We've seen recent reports that our world is on track to exceed 2.7 degrees of increased heating. You have Antonio Guterres, the General Secretary of the UN, increasingly saying that we are looking at the era of global boiling. And of course, so carbon and global warming is just one element of environmental breakdown. When I saw this photo, I thought it was a fake. It's not, sadly. It's a beach in Indonesia, and I use it really just to illustrate that, of course, there are so many aspects where we are seeing evidence that Mother Nature is hemorrhaging under the pressure that we are putting on her. If I can get this. But of course, it is not everyone, and we're living in a world that is deeply unequal. The two pictures I'm sharing with you now is the one on the left, or the right. I'm looking at them here, it's the left for me. But the cocktail is, at the time the photo was taken, this was the world's most expensive cocktail. And it was called the Winston, after, guess who? Winston Churchill. And I'm embarrassed to say it, it's at a bar in Melbourne. And at the time it went for over 12,000 Australian dollars. And of course, we see this capturing of wealth by those at the top, really aggravated since times of COVID times in recent years. At the same time that people, and you see so heart-wrenchingly in the cartoon, people are really struggling to, in rich countries like New Zealand and Australia, take care of the basic needs for their family. And the more you look at that photo, the more detail you will notice the little holes in the sock, the mould in the corner, the fact that they're eating, just the son is eating microwaved can of beans, and the sort of mildew on the window. And I mean, I was reading today that the wealthiest New Zealanders have about 68 times the wealth of the median population here. And so, we're talking very, very extremes of access to wealth, which is, of course, more extreme than inequality of income. And this is a picture, and sorry, it's a pretty rubbish photo. I've got a few other rubbish photos I'm going to show you tonight that I take when I'm walking in cities. But this is a park right next to South Bank in Brisbane. And if any of you have been to South Bank, it is a festival of money, casinos, swanky hotels, very trendy people. This park is just one street back. And you can see there more and more people sleeping in tents. Under every bridge in every capital city in Australia, you will see loads of people sleeping in tents. The gross regional product of a city like Brisbane is 160 billion. So it's an incredibly wealthy city, and yet we see people sleeping in tents. And it just goes to the fact that it's a huge malfunctioning and misallocation of resources. And, sorry, it's a bit of a delay. I mentioned earlier that I'll come back to the word we, or humanity, is putting pressure on the planet. And of course, it's not all of humanity. There is huge inequality in who it is, who is pushing Mother Nature beyond what she can handle. This is research published just last year from my colleagues at Oxfam, where they broke down consumption-based carbon emissions by income decile.
And rather ironically, or perhaps appropriately, it mirrors that champagne glass of the Winston cocktail that you can see. And what this shows you is that the richest 10% of the world's human beings are responsible for half of the world's CO2 emissions. And the poorest half of the world's population together are responsible for around 8%. And of course, there's huge inequality. That inequality of pressure on the planet is almost inversely related to who it is who's most harmed, who most bears the brunt of the impact of environmental breakdown. And I suspect none of this will come as news to those of you here tonight. If you want resources for any of this, I'm happy for you to drop me a line later and I can email you any of these sources or share the slides if that's helpful as well. Sorry, I'm getting used to this. And so, of course, this picture of pushing Mother Nature beyond what she can handle, the increased reality of environmental breakdown and the huge inequality is creating a world where so many people are despairing. And here in New Zealand, we're seeing rising levels of mental health challenges, rising levels of anxiety, huge levels of loneliness, particularly amongst young people. And what we see is people reaching for coping mechanisms. As here in the picture, yes, the economy has never been healthier, but the drugs needed to cope with it have never been more affordable. We see people reaching for coping mechanisms here at the pillbox, the metaphorical pillbox, but also, as depicted in this cartoon, at the ballot box. And we see the rise of sort of extremist politics and the rise of the far right in legislatures around the world, and of course just a few weeks ago with the election of Donald Trump. We see people angry that the system is not working for them, angry that their lifestyle that they thought they'd be entitled to is out of stock, angry that living standards are flatlining for their children, angry that they are not earning as much as they used to. Young people scared because of climate breakdown, of what's coming. And people are internalising that anger and that stress, and they're reaching for these coping mechanisms. They're reaching for short-term solutions. And of course, the solutions offered by these populist politicians will not make life better. But we see people reaching out for some sort of break on the current system. And this system is, of course, the economic system, the way it's been designed, the way we produce and consume, and who is winning and who's losing out of that system. And this is Donella Meadows. Many of you might know her work. She's passed away a few years ago, an incredible systems thinker. She was one of the lead authors on the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth report from 1972. And she really warns us here that these sort of symptoms that we are seeing, hunger, despair, environmental breakdown, drug addiction, all sorts of inequality, they persist. Is this coming off? Okay, does that mean I can walk? Oh, good. Not too far. There's a camera apparently I have to stay put for. But that's good. That means I can stroll a bit. So she says these problems that we've got, they persist in spite of all this effort, this technical brilliance, this analytical ability, and probably many of you are part of that work, analysing the problems, trying to come up with solutions to these challenges that society faces. And she says, despite all of that, they still persist. And she says that's because they are system problems. They emerge because of the way the system structures produce them. And this is her rallying call to us. She says we need to see the system as the source of its problems and find the courage and the wisdom to restructure that. And so that is really very unashamedly where the Wellbeing Economy agenda comes in, is saying we need to understand the way the economic system is creating these challenges and dare to imagine an economic system that is much better aligned with meeting the needs of people and planet. And I just want to really crudely give a sense of what it is of today's system that we're looking at here. And I describe it as the long road option. And very crudely, it's essentially the agenda of get the economy to grow bigger, but almost turn a blind eye to the damage to people and planet that agenda creates. And then what you see, if you're lucky, governments sequestering some financial resources back through taxes, which of course they then use to channel that money back to dealing with often inadequately, to the damage that was created in step one, helping people and planet survive and cope and really heal and patch and repair after that damage that growth-orientated agenda created. It's a very fraught conversation. Governments are very, very reluctant to increase taxes. You cannot talk about raising taxes in Australia at the moment, completely off the table. And you see so often government resources spent on what we describe as failure demand, essentially avoidable costs, driven by the way we've got an unequal system, levels of poverty, despair and alienation. Ecological economists, of course, would talk about defensive expenditure, so much money that gets spent downstream after the fact, repairing, fixing, healing the damage to the environment. And you'll just think of this like, it's like an onion. There are so many examples of this that you'll see almost every day in your news. Increased spending on repair of buildings after a huge flood, increased overtime for emergency services, dealing with huge bushfires that my country's had recently, increased spending on anti-anxiety treatments, huge chunk of the accident and emergency, the criminal justice system, and so on. There's a term I want to share with you, guard labour. Don't know if anyone's heard that term. And it's essentially saying that so many jobs, and it's American research published about 15 years ago or so by Harvard economists. And at the time, they estimated that well over 1 million people in the US were employed in guard labour, security guards, installing security systems, essentially jobs created because people are scared of each other. And I thought, well, that's quite low. It feels like it might be a lot higher now. And I tried to find some updated research, and I found some from about 5 years ago. And what was revealed that in American cities, there are cities where more people are employed in guard labour than are employed as teachers, which I think is a really, really staggering indictment of how things are set up in the States. Speaking of how things are set up, here's another bad photo of mine that I've tried to take. But look closely at this picture here, right? So this is a co-location where you've got people going to the gym. I don't know if you've got the brand Club Lime here. But at the same time, Hungry Jack's is probably owned by the same company, I suspect. And essentially, why I think this photo is staggering, because they're literally in the same building on a huge corner of a street in Canberra where I live. To me, it just absurdly sums up how we're trying to do something right. We're trying to create good lives for people. We're trying to create good lives for our family. And yet, we keep butting up against the damage that the economic system is doing. So we're creating the same blockers, undermining that agenda, just as we're sort of trying our best to create the world we want. There's a wonderful quote I want to share with you from an American scholar, Frances Moore Lappy, and she says, "Why is it that we are collectively creating a world that none of us as individuals actually want?" And I think that just gets to the heart of it. So we can have a big discussion about the why we've got this economy in the discussion later. But I want to get a little bit more positive now. Actually, no, I'm not yet. Let me tell you, I promise I will get more positive. Let me tell you about diminishing marginal returns. If any of you have studied economics, you'll probably be familiar with this idea, but I was explaining it to my brother, that you need all bit of salt in your diet, don't you? Without enough salt, you sort of have physiological problems. But too much salt starts to do damage. Same it is with economic growth, that we all need, societies, countries need a bit of economic growth. There's a big caveat to that, because if it has to be used well, it has to be used to invest in collective institutions. Health systems, sanitation systems, education systems. And when that happens, you see at early stages of economic development fairly decent returns in terms of social progress. So what you see on the x-axis here is GDP per capita, and on the y-axis is a measure of over 50 different dimensions of social progress that come from a group called the Social Progress Imperative. And you can see at early stages of economic growth, fairly decent returns, but they start to flatline, they start to tail off. And you can see a country like Costa Rica up here on the left-hand side, and just scroll along, stay horizontal, and you'll see South Korea. So almost identical levels of social progress according to this index, but a difference in GDP per capita of about 40,000 or 30,000 US dollars. Another way of looking at that, very, very similar approach, GDP per capita along the x-axis, and in this instance, life expectancy along the Y. Very, very similar story of diminishing marginal returns. You could put life satisfaction along the y-axis, or you could put material footprint along the x-axis, and you'd see very, very similar patterns. And yet, the agenda is just keep growing the economy, just focus on the economy to the exclusion of all other goals. This cartoon, you can guess when it came out, just after the Black Summer bushfires in Australia, about the time that the then Prime Minister was saying, we will not have economy-busting environmental regulation. That didn't get him very far, thank goodness. So, this is my last chart, I promise, of the bad news. This is work done... I can't, do you want to do it? All right, gosh. So, and it's got a highlight. So this is work done by ecological economists at the University of Leeds. Click one more, it's highlighted. New Zealand's highlighted. Click it, you'll see a little highlight. Yeah, click it, there's a little highlight. I was very high-tech with my PowerPoint slides. So what the ecological economists did is they looked around the world for countries, so it was very much on the country average, so that's a huge caveat, given we've just talked about internal inequalities, but hold that caveat. They looked around the world for countries that were able to lift their citizens, on average, above a series of social dimensions, but at the same time looking for countries that did not breach various aspects of biophysical boundaries. And the bad news is that they couldn't find anywhere. So what you get is countries like Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, oh, nice work. See this clicker master, very impressive, who are on average, and remember those caveats, on average, able to, at least in theory, lift their citizens above a social foundation. But they are treading very, very heavily on the planet because they are transgressing a huge number of biophysical boundaries. Or you get countries down this corner who are not able to meet the most basic needs of their citizens, but who are treading very lightly. And essentially this, to me, is a dire indictment of the recipes that policymakers have used over the last post-war era. We haven't got a solution in terms of the policy agenda, essentially the economic models that countries and governments have created and constructed, that is able to deal with both sides of this conversation. And we know that until we deal with both sides of this conversation, we haven't really got a sustainable model in either socially or environmentally. So it is a time for new recipes. Did you have this equivalent? Yeah. So this is like the book of my childhood. These gorgeous recipes of sort of these beautiful cakes from the 1980s. But now I think we can hope we're a little bit more sophisticated. We've grown up a little bit and we can get a bit trendier with the recipe, a bit more grown up, a bit more nuanced, focusing maybe a little bit more on quality. And I use it just a little bit flippantly to say that those 20th century recipes may have had their time, but we're in a new era now. And we need to develop different economic models, different recipes for taking care of each other. And that's where the Wellbeing Economy agenda really comes in. And the most simple way I can describe the wellbeing economy is essentially having an economy, as Gareth said, that is very deliberately designed to deliver what people and planet need. Just a little footnote to that. I'll tell you about this photo. Why I love this photo is because someone once showed a picture to me that said, if you are lucky enough to drink wine by the sea, you are lucky enough. And just that, I mean, all that is embodied in that phrase, you've got enough disposable income that you can buy something like wine. You've got enough time, so you're not having to work 3 jobs on minimum wage just to put food on the table. So you've got time to go and drink wine by the sea. The sea is not rising and flooding your home. I just wanted to share with that because I think it's quite a beautiful encapsulation of maybe this idea of being lucky enough. So it is that post the period of diminishing marginal returns. That's the point where we think, okay, we've met our basic needs. Maybe we're lucky enough now. But that's a forbidden conversation in economics in countries like ours. So the Wellbeing Economy agenda is really saying, okay, let's have that conversation. What is it that we need more of because it's good for people and planet? And what do we need to power down if we're really honest, because that economic activity is undermining what people and planet need? And many of you probably recognise this image. This is kind of the sort of 1990s view of sustainable development that came out of the sort of Rio process. I think this is one of the most dangerous images in the world, because it essentially implies that the economy is on a par with the environment and society. It sort of subtly lodges that in your brain, that the three are all of equal billing. And in a way, what's at the very heart of the Wellbeing Economy agenda is taking very seriously what ecological economists have been saying for decades, what feminist economists, like your own Marilyn Waring, have been saying for decades, and what First Nations communities here in New Zealand and around the world have been living for millennia, understanding that the economy is nested within society, and the two are nested within our precious biophysical natural world. And to take that very seriously means we really need to start seeing the economy as in service of social and environmental goals, as a provisioning system, as a strategy that we need to ask very different questions about the economy, such as how well is it going in terms of delivering for people and planet, and what do we need to change to get it much better aligned with delivering what we all want and what we need from the planet. So when I talk about your real needs, this is about going upstream. And this is an example of the difference between the two. This is probably quite beautiful little initiative that was launched in Wales a few years ago to give folks who are sleeping rough stab-proof coats that can be turned into sleeping bags. Now, which all sounds great, but my goodness, that is a downstream response. Because what is it that people who are sleeping rough in Wales really need? They need shelter and warmth and safety. And so the Wellbeing Economy agenda is not disparaging of these emergency downstream responses. They are humanitarian responses to an inhumane economic system. But it is saying we need to dare to ask why. What is going on behind the fact people are sleeping rough in rich countries like Wales, and dare to take action upstream. I want to just pause for a moment and talk about the material basis of wellbeing and why we put the adjective well-being in front of the economy, because I have a bit of a problem with the term well-being because it's often morphed into wellness or happiness. And when I lived in Glasgow, my local newsagent had a ton of magazines along its shelves talking about, your guide to wellness and happiness magazines. You've probably got similar periodicals here in New Zealand. So I was a bit curious. So I opened up one of them and it said 5 ways to well-being. So this is a photo I took of its table of contents. And it said, right, here you go, to get your well-being, you do some meditation, take your dog for a walk, go out jogging, have your friends over for cocktails, or go on a yoga retreat to Thailand, which all sounds pretty nice. But if you are working those 3 jobs just to be able to give your kid a can of baked beans heated in the microwave like that chap we saw in the cartoon earlier, you're not going to be able to have the disposable income to invite your friends around for a drink, let alone go on a yoga retreat to Thailand. If your home is being flooded or you're being evacuated because of a huge bushfire exacerbated by the pressure that a certain percentage of the population are putting on the planet, then you won't have time to do meditation, but probably that is exactly what you need. And if you live in a community where you don't feel safe going out at night, taking your dog for a walk or going for a jog is also going to be out of reach. And so I think we need to keep coming back to what are the material basis of well-being, and that brings the economic system squarely into our sights. So, this is another piece. I want to show you sort of almost the difference between a lot of other, perhaps related agendas. So people around the world are carrying a lot of burdens, and you can see that epitomised here. He's got his load on his head, he's carrying a huge bag, he's reaching for coping mechanism. You can see the cigarette there in his hand. And so the resilience response and this is a term that's got a lot of currency at the moment, the resilience response would be essentially help chaps like him or communities like him to withstand those burdens, take more of those punches. The empowerment response would be support those individuals to carry more burdens. The common factor there is it's very much about change the person. The wellbeing economy response is unashamedly about how do we lessen those burdens, asking where they came from, who and what holds them in place and who benefits from their existence. And so that's about changing the system, not changing the person. And that is almost at the heart of the different focus. And it's compatible, because again, I don't want to denigrate helping people and planets survive and cope today and tomorrow. But this is a call to say, let's go upstream as far to the economy and take action there. Right, now I'm going to get more positive and tell you a bit about what the wellbeing economy starts to look like in practice. It's a little bit like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle with loads and loads of different shifts necessary. None of them enough on their own, but together they can start to change the economic ecosystem. So we're talking here things like how we produce our food, how we design cities, transport mechanisms, how we deliver energy, nature of business models, how we do taxation, and everything in between. So from the very local right up to the supranational. So imagine it like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. And what do you do if you're starting a jigsaw puzzle? You start with the corners. So to get my head around that whole suite of different changes that are needed to build a wellbeing economy, I talk about the 4 Ps that we can cluster, loosely cluster, these are not hardcore boxes, but loosely cluster those changes into. And these are purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, keep clicking, and people-powered. And so purpose is about asking those questions that I was talking about earlier. What is the purpose of the economy? Is it seen as an end in itself, or are we going to reconceptualize it as a mechanism and a means to create the sort of lives that we want to take care of the planet? And the sort of practical things you'd see in this corner of the jigsaw puzzle are the various multi-dimensional wellbeing frameworks that a lot of governments around the world have got. Australia last year launched its Measuring What Matters framework. You've of course got the Living Standards framework. In fact, over 2/3 of OECD governments have these multi-dimensional wellbeing frameworks. Just not using them very much. Again, we can come back to that in discussion later. But also for-purpose business models. I've been meeting today with incredible organisations that are supporting businesses, often led by Maori and Pacifica individuals, who are saying our purpose is to take care of our community and take care of our planet. We want to be commercially viable, but we want to use the business with purpose to deliver these sorts of benefits. Prevention is about saying how can we do better than just spending all this money downstream after the fact on repair and response and clean up and heal. Downstream, end of pipeline activity. It's about saying can we dare to look upstream and find examples of the root causes of some of those challenges and take action there. So to give you a couple of fairly obvious examples, the more our energy systems are powered by renewable energy, the less we'll be having to spend on carbon capture, sequestration and storage. And the new UK government has just announced a couple of weeks ago a huge amount of money to go into carbon capture, sequestration and storage. The more circular our production and consumption systems are, the less our surfers will be having to do these lovely beach cleanups and plastic collections that or we'll be going out on Sunday mornings doing, Clean Up Australia Days, which is an Australian institution. I'm sure you have your equivalent here. The more jobs pay people enough to live on, the less our welfare systems will be having to do taxes and transfers. And in Australia, one of the big budget line items in last year's budget was a huge amount of rent assistance. Also a huge amount of spending for community organisations, in the words of the Treasurer, to deal with increased demand. The more jobs meet those fundamental needs of a sense of dignity and purpose and competence and autonomy and relatedness, the less GPs will be having to write prescriptions for anti-anxiety treatments. So it's about saying, of course, let's do this short-term response, but also let's walk and chew gum at the same time and look upstream and take action there. Pre-distribution, I'm a bit biased, it's my favourite corner of the jigsaw puzzle, because it's essentially saying, yes, that redistribution that work of taxes and transfers, that long road option I described earlier, is utterly crucial to reduce the gap between rich and poor in a country. But it's a huge heavy lift for the government. It's vulnerable to all the horrible political machinations and stigma that comes along with welfare payments and the welfare agenda. So it's utterly critical, but it's really hard to do sufficiently. And so pre-distribution is about saying, how can the market be designed to do much more of the heavy lifting in delivering the sort of outcomes that communities want. And so the sort of pieces that you'd see in the jigsaw puzzle here would be things like worker-owned cooperatives, social enterprises, the community wealth building agenda that I understand is really building up ahead of steam here in New Zealand, where you're essentially generating the economy from the community up rather than waiting for wealth to trickle down, because we tried that recipe and it didn't work. Also things like true cost accounting. So we see the real cost, perhaps of environmental terms, of the goods and services we buy. So things aren't artificially cheap, and so we're getting misleading price signals. So you get the point of pre-distribution. And then a final point around people-powered. Really making sure that people feel in control of decisions that impact them, and particularly they're in control of the direction of the economy. So things like citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, economic democracy of various form, the beautiful agenda of the just transition agenda, making sure communities feel that they are at the forefront of designing transition plans. And one of the organisations I work with in Australia is called The Next Economy, and they work with communities that are currently essentially dependent on coal mining or gas-fired power plants, and they work with communities to imagine what's over the horizon and how to build a transition plan to have an economy that's not based on carbon. So they're the sort of pieces that you'd see, and this and many, many others. And the good news is that there are loads and loads of people here in New Zealand and around the world working on various aspects of those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. I want to give you a couple of examples, and as you heard, I've spent quite a little of time in Scotland. So just to take you to one country, to give you a sense, the Scottish government, this is a slide I nicked from one of their slide decks, because they took the 4 Ps and they've mapped some of their programs against those 4 Ps. So you can see here the National Performance Framework. This is one of those multi-dimensional wellbeing frameworks that I mentioned that over 2/3 of the OECD governments have. They've got various wellbeing agendas. In their prevention, their work around just transition to net zero, something called the Fair Work Nation, their circular economy bill. In pre-distribution, they're really highlighting their land reform. Scotland, many of you probably know, is hugely unequal in terms of ownership of land. Their community wealth building agenda, as I just discussed, they have a minister for community wealth building, and there's a community wealth building bill currently going through Parliament. They've recently had a huge review of different business models, and they're saying we want to, and their Scottish Enterprise, which is their big enterprise agency, has a dedicated unit to support the number of cooperatives and social enterprises that basically make up the Scottish economic ecosystem. So they're trying to elevate those sorts of business models because they know they are good for people and planet. And in terms of people-powered, things like citizens' assemblies, their Community Empowerment Act, where they're transferring various assets to be community-run and community-controlled. Just one more country I wanted to take you with, one of my other favourite parts of the world. Has anyone been to Bologna in Emilia-Romagna? And you know why it's special? Yeah. 1/3 of Bologna, or Emilia-Romagna, the sort of region around Bologna, 1/3 of their GDP comes from worker-owned cooperatives. It's a really special economic ecosystem, and guess what? The results of that are that you have high levels of female participation. It's one of the richest cities in Italy, very proud political activism, and look up the Sardines if you want an example of that, where they're really resisting the rise of the far right. And high levels of wages. These things matter. A friend of mine who's a Scottish chap who passed his business over to the worker ownership, it was a paper-making business, and he then went on to do a PhD in his later life, sort of looking at different towns in northern Italy. And he said that towns that had a high percentage of cooperatives had higher levels of voting, higher levels of education, and even higher levels of things like blood donation than even towns just a few miles up the road that didn't have that high level of cooperatives in the local economy. Business models really matter because they're about control and direction of the economic ecosystem. I want to just sort of, as I come to the end of what I want to share with you before we get into the discussion, is really reflect on the idea of the role of business in this conversation. And this term, the business community, is one of my least favourite phrases because it really implies that there is a sort of homogeneous business community out there that all thinks the same and acts the same. But of course, there is the good, the bad and the ugly in the business community. And you get, and you probably as New Zealanders all love digging, Qantas, which is fine. Qantas during COVID were utter horrible people. They threw their workers out, they cancelled flights. I mean, the level of just really bad faith business behaviour. But guess what? Their share price has gone up and up and up. They behaved in a way that is not aligned with what people and planet need except share prices. So a very extractive way of behaving. And then on the other hand, you had lovely businesses in Scotland, many of the Scottish whisky distilleries, when COVID hit, saying, right, we want to be part of this collective effort. What can we do? We know how to make alcohol. And we are going to use our stills, we're going to repurpose them to make that sanitising hand gel that hospitals at early stages of COVID were crying out for. And in fact, Gerard Sabiti, who's a Harvard economist, has said there's this emerging fourth sector of businesses and enterprises that are commercially viable but are focusing on other outcomes, from social enterprises to community interest companies to worker co-ops to economy for the common good. There's a whole list you can see on Sabiti's website of all these different models. And so when I say that, the business community is my least favourite phrase, I want to really elevate these sorts of businesses because they're what we need more of in a wellbeing economy. And so this is one of my favourite examples. This is a worker co-op in Glasgow. If you go to any health food store in Glasgow and buy a can of chickpeas or a bag of chocolate-coated yogurt or raisins or something, it's probably come from Green City Whole Foods. It's a really well-known, well-loved brand, and it's a worker cooperative. It's been around since the 70s, so it must be doing something right. And their mission is really to reduce their supply chain impact and serve the needs of their member owners. This is a telephone company called Fairphone. It's based in the Netherlands. I don't know if you've got similar here. It's a B Corp, and their mission really is to challenge that planned obsolescence that we get in phones by certain other manufacturing companies, where essentially if one tiny bit breaks, you have to throw out the phone and buy a new one. They are conflict-free and modular, as you can see in this image. So if something breaks, as I had one, and the camera broke, so I wrote to them and they posted over to me a new camera and a tiny little screwdriver, and I was able, I asked my husband actually because I'm rubbish at these things, but he unpacked it like this and he put back in the new camera and then did it up and it was fine. And so this is their mission, is to just say, let's not throw things away just because something tiny and perhaps deliberately breaks inside one of our electrical products. Let's have a company that's designed to be modular and keep things in practice. This is a restaurant in Sydney, and if any of you have been to it or get to go to it, please let me know, because I have tried to go there and I just keep it's full every time I go. It's called Re, and their motto is that, their tagline, it's everything that you touch would have gone to landfill. So these beautiful looking meals here, they have made with food that other restaurants just would have thrown on the skip. Even their funky looking cocktails and these gorgeous bars, their tables and so on, made from Tupperware that other restaurants would have thrown out, and plastic that other restaurants would have thrown out. And again, it's just this great way. Of course, they need to be commercially viable, but they're doing so to operate in a very different way. That idea of the circular economy just embodied in one beautiful, gorgeous looking restaurant. So please, if you're in Sydney, go along and let me know how it was, because I'm super keen to check it out. But of course, it's bigger enterprises as well. This is Triodos Bank, their headquarters. It's just won a Sustainable Design Architecture Awards. They're a Dutch bank. My bank in the UK is with Triodos, my current account. They're a B Corp, and they've also got their mission essentially to channel financial credit and financial capital to the sort of economic activities that we need more of in the 21st century. So renewable energy, various other sustainability activities. They have recently come out with their big economic outlook that most banks publish every year. What's the economic outlook? Their economic outlook, and you can find it online, is around the economy in a post-growth era. So there's a big company starting to name the need to look beyond growth as the dominant factor in our economic models. This is lots of Scottish examples, I'm sorry, but I hope they're good. This is a Edinburgh-based company called Faith in Nature, and if you go into a friend's bathroom next time you're in the UK, you'll probably see shampoo by the side of their shower or hand gel by their sink that comes from Faith in Nature. They're a really, really popular brand. They have just appointed to their board someone whose job it is to represent the needs of nature. Every single board meeting, there's an academic who has been appointed there to stand up for nature in every board decision. It's awesome, isn't it? And this is really to give a sense that these conversations are starting to enter the mainstream in fits and starts. And what's that beautiful phrase that the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed? Well, it's starting to get into some of these mainstream institutions. This is the World Economic Forum's big report that they published at Davos this year, saying we cannot just look at the conventional GDP growth picture because it's incomplete if we're not understanding the nature and the quality of that growth. This is another report saying we need a new economy that looks at the root causes. So I basically could have written the opening lines of this report, and we need to look at the principles needed. It goes on to say we're in this polycrisis, a term you've probably heard a lot of recently, but and I love this phrase, we are still trying to retrofit sustainability into a system that is unsustainable by design. Yeah, resembling what Donella Meadows was telling us at the beginning of my conversation with you. And this same report says we need to be guided by these principles of sufficiency, circularity, systems thinking, value redefined, and equity and justice. Pretty nice. This was written by the major consulting firm Ernst & Young just a couple of months ago. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that everyone in Ernst & Young is embracing, this agenda. But I think it's really telling that a major consulting firm is starting to have a new economy unit that comes out with reports really calling out the unsustainable economic system and saying we need to really embrace these new principles. I think it's really, really interesting and perhaps even, dare I say it, hopeful. But we're up against a hell of a lot of challenges that are pushing back and undermining and hampering progress to building a wellbeing economy. And I was commissioned last year to write a report for the Club of Rome around the pushback to this agenda. And I'll just rattle them off because I suspect in your various different spheres of work, they may be familiar to you. Things like the dead hand of the status quo in our institutions and our bureaucracy, how so many politicians have lack of bandwidth to focus on anything other than crisis to crisis to crisis. It's just like they're playing whack-a-mole. There are a hell of a lot of deliberate blockers to this agenda. I talk about 3 different blockers in the Club of Rome report. We've got a lot of weak implementation and co-option, and to give one example, there are some governments that talk about having a wellbeing economy, but then they say, if you have more wellbeing, that's good. That's good for the economy. So they're deliberately sort of confusing the means and ends there. And it's a really positive, inclusive term, the wellbeing economy, deliberately so. But one of the risks is that we have to sort of become the sort of implementation police and call it out when it does get co-opted to that extent. Similarly, there's some confusion with other agendas. People are impatient for quick results. This is a long-term change. Fortunately, there are examples of some of those jigsaw puzzles that will deliver pretty quick results. Living wages would be an example. The community wealth building agenda that we talked about earlier and that we're seeing examples of here in New Zealand. There's a town in Preston in northern England that has implemented community wealth building with gusto. Their mayor, Matthew Brown, is a bit of a celebrity in the community wealth building space. He's written some great books and reports. That town has been assessed to be one of the most economically resilient cities in England. Even things like subjective well-being has increased, and mental health challenges in Preston have gone down since the implementation of the community wealth building agenda. See, there are things we can do to offset the impatient for immediate impact, but I think we need to really hold that this is a long-term game plan, and there are a lot of countervailing forces. So you can be doing good here and here, but when business as usual is still washing over it, those countervailing forces can overwhelm that great work. There's also a way that politicians find it a lot easier, despite the fact they complain about lack of money, they still find it a lot easier to write a cheque for a downstream response, because that does not require them to tackle imbalances of power and wealth and resource capture. That's easier than to write a cheque for that downstream response. They also love what I describe in the report as cut the ribbon moments, where they can cut the ribbon, get a photo, it can go on their social media and in their newsletters. This work doesn't lend itself to cut the ribbon moments. This is about upstream economic system change. So it's not necessarily giving the sort of tools or the goodies to politicians, even recognising the reality of the context in which they operate. Our movement, I think all too blatantly, clearly, has not built an adequate support base for this agenda. There is a ton of opinion polling, and I collect this stuff, I'm a bit of a geek for it. There's a ton of opinion polling that shows people are supportive of this agenda, supportive of its component parts, but we need to translate that nice opinion polling into really active mobilisation. And that requires reaching out to audiences that do not come to Fabian lectures on a Tuesday night, with all due respect, who do not read the nice websites and beautiful policy papers that we write. We as a movement need to be much better at engaging communities that have been really shafted by the current economic system, but are turning to these insincere, shortcut, apparent solutions that will never work and are often racist and divisive from populist politicians. So that's a really big one, and that's where a lot of my thinking and energy is going at the moment. And there's also a bit of friendly fire in this community. We're often our own worst enemy. We need people deep within the system, working for governments, policy entrepreneurs, people working inside to change from the inside. We need the radicals outside, calling it out, holding to the account, and we need everything in between. And it all matters, and yet so often we get, and I've had this a lot myself, folks from within the movement thinking that their method is the only one, not really recognising the need for the toolbox of different measures and how together they start to add up and enable different changes to happen. There are some hopeful signs, and things like, as I said, opinion polls, and perhaps even more importantly, deliberative democracy exercises like a lot of citizens' assemblies. It's worth, if you want some hope, looking at the results of the UK's Citizens' Assembly on climate or the Scotland Citizens' Assembly on a just transition. People, when they're given a chance to deliberate, are really up for bold measures. And politicians often don't credit them with that. The public are not there. When folks are given a chance to really think about this, they're really up for some really quite bold moves. We are seeing some people in governments recognise that business as usual is not good enough. And we're seeing, and you'll probably all know some of them, probably you are some of them, these people who I describe as policy entrepreneurs, working inside different layers of government to bring about change from the inside. The European Parliament last year hosted a massive Beyond Growth conference. Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, European Parliament, opened that conference. Iceland, the government of Iceland has now had 2 of what will be a series of 5 annual events looking at the Wellbeing Economy government's agenda. We're seeing largely the debate move beyond statistics. And yes, we could always probably have more statistics, more timely data, particularly the Australian case shows how the Bureau of Statistics was sort of decimated and they're having to catch up with collection of data. But I think in a way, lack of statistics is no excuse. We know some of these challenges. We need to move now to making those measures matter. And that means the baton being passed from statisticians to policy entrepreneurs and policy entrepreneurs to really start to redesign government processes in accordance with what we need. The ESG agenda, when it's at its most robust, I know there's a spectrum, but loads and loads of enterprises, and many, many here in New Zealand, showing how the private sector can be part of positive change. We're seeing things like donut economics and the community wealth building agenda show what this starts to look like locally. And we're even seeing a couple of funders, not nearly enough, but starting to grapple with the need for system change, not just funding food parcels or mosquito nets, but really starting to look upstream. I want to leave you with a quote, and I think it's incredibly profound, because it says that this economic system that we're facing is not a success, it's not intelligent, it's not beautiful, it's not just, it's not virtuous, and it's not delivering the goods. And I think we could acknowledge that that's a pretty apt description of where we are today. We see the extent of money that's being spent on failure demand, so it's certainly not intelligent system. It's not beautiful when you look at the damage we are doing to our precious, beautiful natural world, our ecosystems. It's not just, given the extent of inequalities, horizontal and vertical inequalities. It's not delivering the goods, and as we've discussed, more and more people are recognising that. And the quote went on saying, we are beginning to dislike it and despise it. And I think, again, a lot of people know in their guts that business as usual cannot carry on. But when we wondered what to put in its place, we are extremely perplexed. This was John Maynard Keynes writing almost 90 years ago. So I think the good news is that while the beginning of his words are pretty apt for today, I think the latter part of his words are not. I think we do know what to put in its place. I think the good news is that there are amazing people around the world, like Gareth and his colleagues, and I suspect many of you here, and I'd love to hear the work that you're doing. We do know what to put in its place. We've got the visions of a different economic system. We start to know the component parts of that jigsaw puzzle. The trick is really building that momentum to create the economic system that we so urgently need and deserve. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Katherine. Okay, we've got question time. The Fabians we've come up with a couple of rules around questions, Phil, haven't we? We'd like a questioner to give us their name. Yeah, their name. And so we can track them, is that? No. And we'd also like you to ask a question, which is a difficulty for some of us. So if you are going to give a speech, Phil has said he'll wait behind and you give it to Phil, but you ask Katherine the question. So here we go. Questions?
My name's Joseph. I just wanted to ask, are people considering Bill Mollison's idea of the problem is the solution? The problem is the solution. If we've got all these people who are in despair, who are disconnected, who are angry because of the inequality, the reductions in their opportunities, etc., etc. As what you were talking about doing today, the communication with people who are not part of the Western elites, who see things differently, collectively more inclined toward collectivism, communicating with them about new systems, harnessing the power of people who are really angry and want something different. That's what I'm saying. The problem of all that kind of social disconnect, is this being seen as the way forward?
Thank you, Joseph. Not going, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot in that I do think there is a sense that business as usual is not good enough. And as I say, people are reaching for those coping mechanisms at the pillbox and at the ballot box. And I do think, and I've written about this and been increasingly talking about this, how that broad economics change movement, of which I'm a small part, I don't think has done a good enough job of reaching out to those communities. And I think there are almost two big audiences that we haven't been good enough at reaching out. One is people who are really done bad, faring really badly in the current system, and which are those growing numbers. And we see people, reaching for those solutions, voting for the far right, and just angry and wanting the sort of to give the big finger to the economic system, but bringing in these fascists who are not going to really take care of them, who don't really care about their needs. That's one audience that I think the economic change movement, I don't yet know how to do this at scale, so any ideas welcome, but needs to do much better at sitting down with these communities, listening to their concerns, understanding their anger and their fears, and working with them to co-create the sort of changes needed, and helping people feel that the economy is something they have a right to think about and talk about and ask harder questions about, and let alone change, because often the economy is something that people feel is something remote, and it's a terrain of pie charts and spreadsheets and numbers on a screen and men in pinstripe suits, and people feel, well, it's out of, beyond what I can think about. And actually we're all really impacted by the economy, and our decisions make up the economy too, and so we have to bring people into a conversation around how the economic system, as a tagline for We All's conference on Thursday, the economy has been designed. We can design it collectively in a different way. The other group that I think we also need to have a go at engaging much more proactively is the group that I'm describing as the economic establishment, who, by virtue of doing very well financially from this current system, are able to change the rules of the game in their favour and essentially lock in the current system. And so there's some of those deliberate blockers that I had on my list there. And so there needs to be a way, not all of them, but to find allies with some folks in that community. And groups like Patriotic Millionaires are a good example of that. They're a UK group who are being very, very assertive now in calling out the challenges of the system, saying to governments, tax us more. It's insane that we do not pay as much proportionate tax as, Warren Buffett very famously said. His cleaner pays more tax proportionately than he does. And I don't think we'll ever get all of them, but I think the more we have almost spokespeople and messengers from that cluster as well, people who have most benefited from the system calling it out, I think it starts to speak to what Donella called us to do, is sort of put a spotlight on the system, build that system consciousness, and give politicians, yet take away one of their excuses, because often it's those vested interests. And I suspect it's similar here, but in Australia, my gosh, the power of the fossil fuel lobby to double down and terrify. Oh, you've got a recording. Is it something I'm doing? Probably. Can I try this one again?
No. We could go to shorter answers. Not that I. Have we got another question? I'm going up the back. One, two.
Kia ora, Catherine. Thanks very much for that. My name's Boyd Swinburne, and really enjoyed your presentation. It seems to me there's a couple of things that we really need, and one is the short story, the narrative of what we're talking about. I mean, the neoliberal narrative is powerful, it's short, it's understandable, and it cuts through. And I don't feel that we have that. It's kind of what is the picture of your 1,000-piece jigsaw, if you like, to be able to tell it in a short way. And the second thing is, you've given a lot of examples of the kind of organic bits that have grown up. If we're going to wait for all this organic bits to join up, that's a long time. What are the policies that will bring in the guardrails, bring up the laggards, push this along, get the triple bottom line happening? What if politicians are really keen on that, what are the policies they can enact to push this kind of movement, this paradigm further?
Thanks, Boyd.
Yeah, we've got sort of the never-ending mic problem.
Thanks, Boyd. So yes to the narrative piece, and this final slide is my tentative, humble little offering. I have this dream that one day we will replace measures of progress like GDP per capita or regional value add or quarterly profits with things like what I call cornerstone indicators, but an example of which might be the number of girls who ride their bikes to school. Because imagine if that figure is going up. There's a whole lot of contextual pieces and conditions of a really healthy, thriving community that are in place. So that someone once said to me, so what's the picture, your question, what's the picture on the front cover of the jigsaw puzzle? And then we thought, well, it's girls riding their bikes to school, or something similar, something that comes from the community. And I think there's a really important So I'm going into a long answer now, Paul. There's something about the political economy of that, because as I said, so many governments have these multi-dimensional wellbeing frameworks, but they're not using them. They're not connected to the communities that they're intended to serve. They become quite technical manifestations of a good, healthy, thriving community. And most everyday people, when they're talking about dashboards and indicators, they're talking about their car, not about their quality of life. So we need measures that really intuitively resonate with the community in question. And so my offering, my suggestion for one that might pass that test is the number of girls who ride their bikes to school. I love having this as a workshop question with community groups. What would be some cool cornerstone indicators that ticked a lot of the elements of a good quality of life in all its dimensions, but really capture the essence of it? One group in a health promotion conference a few weeks ago said walking down the street and seeing someone smile at you and they have a full set of teeth, and not only because they're not looking at their phone, they're walking along the street, so the streets are safe enough and there's pavements, and then all the health elements that are captured by someone's the health of their teeth. A group in Scotland did it, and they came up with things like for job quality on a Sunday night, not dreading the work week ahead. A group in Sweden, a municipality in Sweden, did the exercise, and one of the ones they came up with was not having a car and being happy about that. Yeah, so I mean, if you think about these over the next few days, I'd love you to let me know if you come up with some interesting ones. Your other piece around the guardrails, we need a whole suite of international agreements around tax, reporting, a whole lot of different conversation at the political level about what the purpose of the economy is, because it's quite easy to have a conversation in the trade union hall on a Tuesday night hosted by the Fabians. But this conversation is such a million miles away from the way, the orthodox economic advice that's going into governments and the microchip that's been put in a lot of government decision makers around the role of the economy and how if we just grow the economy, that will be an automatic solution to so many of our problems. So we need to open up that conversation, because that will enable the subsequent policy change that can then be inspired by the grassroots stuff, these pioneers. And there's a slide I haven't included today where I talk about Frank Giels, who's a systems thinker, who talks about we need change at the landscape paradigm level, the policy regime, and the niche level of activity, and they all work and inspire each other. I will, just one quick bullet point, there's also a group of governments that we all instigated called the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, and these are governments, New Zealand at the time was one of the founding partners, with Scotland and Iceland. During COVID, they were joined by Wales and Finland. Canada is a fully participating member of it. Australia goes along for some meetings as well, as it's starting to learn. And the point of that group of governments is to learn from each other about how to put in place collective wellbeing at the heart of economic policy making, and also go on a journey of continuous improvement. So that peer-to-peer support modelling is so key for governments. They rarely will go out on their own, but maybe together through groups like WeGo. There's been a film made about that story, and the story of someone from the movement who went into politics and just how hard that was. The film is called Purpose. It's purpose.film, and the filmmaker is very open to anyone screening it. Small audiences, big audiences, so you can drop Martin, who's an incredible chap himself, a note to get that story.
Thank you.
Kia ora. Ko Johan toko ingoa. I had a question. I've been thinking the big guys that we are kind of fighting against, they've already done the greenwashing. They fight really hard to get this idea theirs. Could they do well-being washing? And how do we ensure that they do not steal this dream and that we're going fast enough for it to happen? Like, is there already something in place, or did you already thought about that?
Yes, they are. Wellbeing washing, I think, is a real risk. And you see, you probably see this, a lot of companies that are bringing in beautiful equality and inclusion, diversity, at the same time as making a shed load of people redundant, or they're offering, the metaphorical Tai Chi in the car park while cutting people's wages or expecting people to do a lot of unpaid overtime. Governments as well. I mean, the Scottish government is guilty of this. They use the term wellbeing economy just essentially to describe business as usual. When some people in government write it, and this shows that, you know, governments are complex systems. When a guy who's a huge ally and who features in the film I just mentioned, who's the chief economist, when he writes stuff, it's utterly on point. But then his colleagues who know that the wellbeing economy is an explicit agenda for the Scottish government, they just use it. So yeah, it's something we've got to be really, really careful of. And particularly, this is one of the tensions. The more mainstream this agenda is, the more traction it gets, the more we see institutions start to pick it up, which is important because it cannot just stay in the margins. But there's risks of that. So the World Health Organization is doing a ton of work on the wellbeing economy, which is really, really great. You know, seeing groups like Ernst & Young and the World Economic Forum, but we've got to be careful. I mean, in one hand, it's great. They're feeling the need to speak to these agendas, but we've got to really say, are the policies and the changes that they're making, are they truly transforming the economic ecosystem? And I'm often saying to folk, don't look for wellbeing economy policies by doing a word search in a database of policies for the word wellbeing, because most of them won't have the word wellbeing on them. They will be things that maybe tax wealth more, that provide living wages, that maybe regulations that encourage worker cooperatives. There'll be procurement changes that direct local spending. There'll be anything that can help change the economic ecosystem, I'd say is part of the piece, not just labelling something well-being. And actually, 9 times out of 10, it probably won't be.
Any women want to ask you a question?
I'm happy to hand the microphone to a woman if it's an appropriate time for you to make that comment, actually, because the question that I've got is, how do you avoid well-being being tarnished with the woke brush? And I am, I am 50-something, and I sit with my 50-something colleagues and friends at a dinner table, and they all talk about how insane it is that there are 52 types of gender, and that, you know, kids on the age of 16 can get their gender reassigned and all of this kind of stuff. And they just tend to say, and that's ridiculous, and suddenly the well-being agenda is also ridiculous, which I guess is the problem that the Democrats in the US have discovered, which is that you tie yourself too tightly to the DEI agenda. I'm just curious as to how you found it in terms of separating the two.
If you've got thoughts on how, because it's a really good question. I mean, one is that this is, I think the word woke we need to, reclaim and go back to its original meaning, which is being awake to social injustices. So, quite proud to be woke in that sense. I think also this really sincere, authentic agenda of the wellbeing economy is economic system change. It is about quite substantial realignment of power and resource imbalances in the current economy and the system of economic decision making and production and consumption, and who is able to change the rules of the game. So to your 50-something friends, I'd say have another look at what it really is. If they are using the word woke in a pretty insincere way, but if they are using it about being about addressing social injustices, then I'd say, well, okay, yeah, we are woke then. Great. Yeah.
I don't think that they are.
Yeah.
I've got a quick voice, I can do this on my own without the microphone. But I do think that from that point of view, I don't know if you're doing yourself any favours, and this is just really, by using the well-being. Kate with her donut economics, it's much harder to diss donuts than it is well-being. And I think that it doesn't come with all of the various baggage that mindfulness and well-being and all of that kind of stuff. Have you ever thought about becoming or a rebrand in any way? I don't know.
Yeah, and so as I said to you, I was really clear on here's the material basis of well-being, because I hate the way the term morphs into wellness and happiness. And I have a news alert for Wellbeing Economy, and every so often I get, this Hyatt has opened its latest wellness spa. And I'm like, rage. And when people say, Katherine works for the wellness economy, I'm like, ugh. And so I have that same reaction. there have been tests on, and Gareth and his team have sort of done some testing of the word here in New Zealand. They're saying, yeah, we're sticking with it. We think enough people get what it means when they look twice at it. Similar research done in Australia, folks saying, look, it's not brilliant, but there's no other word that's better. I mean, I often describe well-being as quality of life in all its dimensions now and into the future for everyone. That doesn't, I mean, it's hard to... Yeah, and so I reluctantly keep running with the well-being, but it's critical that it's got the economy. To me, this is absolutely about changing the way the economy works, and I always talk about what I mean by well-being and the way the economy affects it, and it's not just about happiness. There's another set of slides I could have shown you. Sorry, Paul, another long answer. So about 15 years ago, I wrote a blog saying that focusing too much on individual subjective well-being is like turning up the volume on your headphones while a riot rages around you. And the car company Audi, and you can go home, look in YouTube, put in your YouTube Audi Escape ad. And it's this ad for an Audi car, and it's filmed in this sort of dystopian, I assume, do you know, Asian city, where there's all this ninja fighting and people battering each other and fires and so on. So a riot. And then the key person in the ad, guess what, gets into an Audi car. His feet warmers come on, magically a glass of champagne appears, and the song Easy Like Sunday Morning comes on, and then his friend's face is smashed up against his window. And so it's basically this ad pretty much proving my point around how we need to focus on the context. But I'm constantly on a little one-woman mission to reclaim the word well-being. I also don't know who would have the legitimacy to do that rebranding too. So it's probably... But no, I absolutely agree with the premise of your question.
Hi, Laurie Ross of New Zealand Nuclear Free Peacemakers, and I've been thinking about another name as well. You know, I put on the Wellbeing Economics Forum up in Titirangi, West Auckland, with Gareth Hughes and the film Outgrow the System. And I realize there is quite a lot of interest, but most people are still thinking within their own local family or community, and it is hard to raise the thinking to a systemic level. And as you say, most people think of well-being in terms of health and meditation and so on, which is very good. But here's an idea for you, and you might like to consider another sort of framing or brand. And I've come up with eco-peace economics, or ecological economics for humanity. What do you think of that?
Thank you, Laurie.
Gorgeous. And there are so many lovely phrases like sustainable well-being or inclusive well-being or thriving within planetary boundaries. There's lots of different ways of describing the vision, and I'm quite relaxed that people are having different terminology. Another way I often describe the well-being economy agenda is a little bit like a picnic blanket. So it's not there to be a competitor, definitely not a competitor, nor even a synonym term for a lot of these other awesome schools of thought like donut economics or regenerative economics or post-growth economics or feminist economics or indigenous economics or steady state economics or future generations thinking or economy for the common good and so on and so on. There's so many different schools of thought out there. And in a way, like, I see the wellbeing economy agenda as a bit like a picnic blanket, welcoming all of them, but showcasing their common core elements. Because while they'll have different emphasis and they'll resonate with different audiences, at their core it is all about seeing the economy as in service of people and planet, seeing the economy as a subset of society and the environment. And I think the bit that probably the wellbeing economy emphasises slightly more is the hope to get things right first time around. So we don't have to do all this post-fact downstream response and repair, you know, really the economy as a system to deliver the sort of lives we want from the beginning. So yeah, I'm quite, you know, there are so many good phrases, and I love yours, Laurie. So yeah, thank you.
And just one other point, one of the terms that I really like in, say, Donut Economics and even Kohei Sato's book, he calls it Degrowth Manifesto. I don't like to use the word communism because that puts people off, but his ideas, his rationale is excellent. But the point I want to make is one of the key issues that probably you will incorporate in your presentations is about the full cost accounting of externalities. And to me, that would be one of the key pillars, like a corner of your 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. Because if every social or environmental damage factor in the procedure of extraction of resources or producing of products or of their use, if all of that was counted, then you would have a completely different system.
Thank you. You'll need to talk to Phil afterwards. I've got 2 more questions, one here and first up here and one over here. That's it. Just a quick point. We use the mic up there because people online can't hear you when you speak from the audience. Question.
Kia ora, I'm Kaya. Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, I liked the scope that you were talking about people that we need to engage. Like, you know, you're talking about people who lean far right because of their poor circumstances, and then also all the way up to sort of like the billionaires and getting them on board. But I wondered if you'd thought about how we engage those who aren't already engaged in any political way when we're talking about something that's so inherently political, like the economy. Like, I know for us, we'll understand that that affects our everyday life and it's a part of everything around us, but how we engage those who see the word economy and are immediately put off.
Awesome question. And I have been lucky enough in some of my work with particularly my Oxfam days to do some deliberative democracy exercises with really marginalised groups in Scotland, and then take that similar methodology and work with Oxfam India to work with Dalit communities, people living in slums in India, women, tribal groups, really marginalised communities. And then a friend of mine did a very similar exercise in Namibia. And the heart of those exercises were really saying to folks, what do you need to live well in your community? Really different contexts, and enabling people to have a deliberative conversation. So not just where an opinion poller comes up with someone with a clipboard quickly, what do you want? Or as someone said, opinion pollers ring you and ask you to tell them what you think when you're not thinking, because you're getting the kids dinner and all sorts of stuff. But the deliberative aspects, I think, is really critical. And really start from first principles. You know, what makes a good life to you? What makes you smile in your local area? What sort of community do we need for your grandchildren to be happy? So one time I'd use the word happy. And what, just as an aside, what was extraordinary about that work we did in really marginalised, deprived communities of Scotland, really struggling communities in India and in Namibia, is they come up with remarkably similar priorities. And it's incredible, even using similar language, and it's something really hopeful and quite beautiful about that, because it just reminds you that these are things, when we really go back to first principles, that make us innately human. We of course have different ways of pursuing those goals, but what deep down most matters to people is incredibly common across the world. And there is something I find, I'm not often hopeful, but there is something extraordinarily special and cause for hope about that deep common and humanity that I think is really special.
One more, last question.
Kia ora, my name's Libby. Part of your answer then actually has answered my next question too, and it's also about engaging various sectors of society, and really, what are the strategies for getting this message to people who have got more than enough, and the others who are deeply committed to getting more than enough because they think that that is the road to happiness, well-being? I think education actually is enormous, and not just in schools, but lifelong learning. I think maybe if we can be finding ways to show that actually this is economically more viable, that actually you are going to win doing this way. But I think we're really up against it. I mean, we're all here because we all agree with this stuff, right? It's getting to the people who don't. It's having this meeting in the Northern Club. So, strategies?
Good.
I utterly agree, and this is a question that keeps me awake at night, is how to move it from this incredible movement and all its wonderful diversity, but clearly we are not winning. We're not winning, and actually things are going back and getting worse. And to me, it has to be about almost building that countervailing force to those very powerful vested interests. And you've probably heard of the rise of the community independents in politics in Australia, and one of their distinguishing features was what they call kitchen table conversations. I think there's something in that, but I'm not sure how to scale that, and that's very much about listening, but what we're really needing here is co-creating and co-learning. There's an initiative called Climate Fresque. Don't know if anyone's heard of it, that I find really inspiring. That I think maybe there's something in that method where you do workshops and train local community leaders. So we need the dudes at the pub, at the Northern Pub. We need the footy coaches. We need the imams. There's a term, homophily, that essentially means that in any group, whether it's a darts team or a parents group at a library, so a group that's similar to each other or has something in common, there's always someone who's a bit cooler and that everyone looks up to. My God, all my netball team, I was always sort of looking up to someone else who's a lot cooler and so on. Those people, if they move on something, everyone else will copy it. And you've probably seen that with your kids and their water bottles, or the way now they're wearing socks, big socks and sliders, and so. But that's how these things get transmitted. So I think we need, and I don't have the practical way. I don't have the game plan for this. So if anyone's good at thinking through practical delivery, please come and chat. But I think it's how do we find those homophilies, work with them around this conversation, and then they take it to their community. But yeah, I think that's what's needed. I don't have the funding pitch yet to put to a funder.
Can I just ask, just to that, what climate risk?
Yeah, Chris, do you want to say a quick word about that? You're probably not better than me.
So, climate fresque is a climate fresque is a 3 hours workshop, but really hands-on, that explains the ins and outs of climate change and placing the human at the center as the cause of it and helping understand the consequence. And it involved the mind, it involved the exchange with people around you and help moving the middle, and it also involved the emotions. So extremely well designed, and it can be delivered to adults but also to kids. It's slightly changed. And it's based on the IPCC report. So it's bringing science to something that is easy to understand, but yet not oversimplifying it. Yes. ESK.
There is an alternative.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. There's something, I think it's a hopeful model.
Talk to these guys at the. We'll call this to a close. It's a fantastic presentation by Katherine. Thank you very much for that, Katherine. She's been the most comprehensive presenter we've had this year. We've had 28 of these seminars this year, and it's all down to your membership fee of $20. And look, we have an offer. If you don't want to pay $20, you can pay nothing. Come along for free at any time. I know Maria was saying, I didn't register. Can I get in? You can get in at any time you like. So we really welcome you here. And we'll see you next year. We've got the Congo, Rwanda seminar been postponed, but it's coming on early in the year. And we've got another range of seminars starting up in February. Have a good Christmas, everybody, from the New Zealand Fabian Society. Go well.